A racist security drags Black Big Shaq out of the bank. No charges, no explanation, just humiliation on full display. But by the time the marble doors close behind Big Shaq, 2.6 billion deposits vanish within hours. This isn't just about ego, it's about legacy, power in a system that just made its worst mistake. Because when silence is weaponized, Big Shaq doesn't protest. Big Shaq pulls the pin. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal, towering and warm-hearted, known to his friends and the public as Big Shaq, stepped into the sprawling glass facade of the downtown San Francisco branch of Interglobal Trust, dressed impeccably in a tailored gray suit that blended authority with a hint of understated charm. He exuded both confidence and approachability. The morning sun cast long, golden beams through the high atrium, catching on the polished marble floors and illuminating his path. His hands were steady, gripping a slim portfolio. Inside were the meticulously prepared documents that would, he hoped, secure funding for the long-planned community center to honor his late father's legacy. Though Shaq's frame drew attention, his demeanor was unassuming. He nodded to the receptionist at the information desk, a young man with sharp features, who offered a tight-lipped smile, his eyes briefly flicking over Shaq's dark skin, before settling on the badge clipped to his lapel. The moment was brief but palpable. Shaq noted the hesitation, but brushed it off with a slight nod, moving forward through the cavernous lobby toward the private client offices. Along the way, the usual murmur of polite greetings and professional chatter seemed just a touch more brittle than usual. Shaq was accustomed to being recognized. His name, his legacy, and his considerable wealth ensured that. Yet today, he noticed a peculiar tension, a glance too long, a whispered conversation, abruptly ending, as he passed, an overly courteous security guard, stepping aside as if to clear the way for someone far more important. It was subtle, a flicker at the edges of an otherwise ordinary day. He approached the thick oak door of the client relations office, where he was scheduled to meet with Catherine Ashbury, a senior executive with a reputation for discretion and efficiency. Her assistant, a middle-aged man with thinning blonde hair and a tight navy suit, stood as Shaq approached. There was a moment's pause, then a brief, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw before he offered a handshake. "Mr. O'Neal," he said, the words crisp but lacking the genuine warmth Shaq had encountered in past meetings. "Catherine will be with you shortly." Shaq thanked him and settled into one of the deep leather chairs, flanking the minimalist reception area. His gaze drifted to the sweeping view beyond the glass walls, the city's pulse alive with cranes, traffic, and the glint of morning light on distant high-rises. The sight usually calmed him, a reminder of growth and progress, but today, a quiet unease gnawed at him. As the minutes ticked by, Shaq noticed a pattern. Clients arriving after him were quickly ushered in, while he remained waiting. His calls to Catherine's office were met with polite apologies and assurances of a delay. The receptionist avoided his eyes now, his fingers tapping nervously on the marble countertop. Shaq's phone buzzed quietly against his thigh, a message from his mother, Lucille O'Neal, simply checking in with a familiar warmth that momentarily softened his tension. He replied with a reassuring line, then leaned back, determined to wait out the inexplicable delay. Across the lobby, a group of sharply dressed bankers in tailored suits huddled, their voices low but punctuated with occasional glances toward Shaq. He caught snippets references to unexpected issues, policy updates, and an unspoken, uneasy awareness that he was somehow at the center of it. An hour passed. The bright optimism of the morning had dulled into a quiet, tense afternoon. Shaq felt the subtle shift from anticipation to frustration. Though he maintained his composure, he thought of his father, a man who had taught him resilience and the quiet strength of dignity under pressure. Finally, a man in an ill-fitting gray uniform, marked clearly with Interglobal Trust's security emblem, approached him. His expression was practiced neutrality, but his body language screamed discomfort. He gestured stiffly for Shaq to stand. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me," he said, his tone clipped, lacking any clear explanation. Shaq stood towering over the guard but choosing not to escalate the moment. His voice was low, calm. "Is there a problem?" The guard hesitated, his lips thinning. "You'll need to come with me to the lobby. There's been an issue." Heads turned across the lobby. Conversation stilled. Shaq felt the weight of a dozen eyes settle on him, not with curiosity but with something colder, suspicion. A bitter taste rose in his throat. He followed the guard, his movements measured, his mind racing through possibilities. They reached the central atrium, where sunlight now felt stark and unforgiving. A second guard joined them, his posture rigid, and the first one spoke into a discreet earpiece. Shaq glanced around, noting the whispering bankers, the receptionist's averted gaze, the way the space seemed to expand and close in all at once. "Mr. O'Neill, there's been a discrepancy with your account," the first guard said, the words delivered with mechanical formality. "We'll need you to leave the premises while we sort it out." Shaq's chest tightened, not with fear but with a searing sense of disbelief. He glanced toward the offices where Catherine Ashbury should have been waiting, toward the glass-walled conference rooms where deals were sealed every day. No one intervened. No one spoke. He could feel the humiliation tightening around him, like a noose. Yet he held himself steady, recalling his father's words about never giving them the satisfaction of seeing you break. He gathered his composure, nodded silently, and walked toward the glass doors as if he were simply leaving by choice. Behind him, the bank's atrium buzzed with speculation, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Outside, the sunlight remained as bright as before, but for Shaq the world had shifted irrevocably. Shaq had barely stepped into the marble lobby's heart when the shift occurred, a subtle tightening of the air, a collective breath held in anticipation. His mind, still focused on his plans for the community center, jolted into sharp awareness as a tall, broad-shouldered man in an immaculately pressed navy suit, with a gold security emblem, strode directly toward him. The man's face was fixed in a practiced expression of authority, but the hard gleam in his eyes betrayed something darker. His nameplate read Hamilton, though Shaq had never seen him before. "Excuse me, sir," Hamilton's voice rang out, sharp enough to cut through the hushed murmurs of the nearby clients and employees. Shaq, who stood merely a head taller, turned slowly, the surprise in his eyes mingling with a flicker of disbelief. "There's an issue with your account. We need you to come with us immediately." The words were crisp, public, and carried no hint of discretion. The conversations in the lobby faltered, a ripple of curiosity and apprehension sweeping across the polished space. Shaq's throat tightened. He glanced at the slender assistant from earlier, who stood frozen behind the front desk, his eyes darting nervously away. The receptionist, too, looked down, pretending to arrange papers that didn't need arranging. "I'm sorry, what issue?" Shaq asked, his voice low but steady. His heart thudded heavily, his mind racing through every legitimate transaction, every meeting scheduled, every document meticulously prepared. His credentials were flawless, his reputation impeccable. Hamilton's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details here," he said, his tone dismissive. "Please come with me." Two additional security guards flanked Hamilton, both younger but wearing the same expressionless mask. The trio's presence loomed, an unspoken threat, though their hands remained at their sides. Shaq felt the cold prickle of realization creeping up his spine. This wasn't a private inquiry, this was an orchestrated display. "I have an appointment with Catherine Ashbury," Shaq said, maintaining his composure, though a hint of steel threaded through his tone. "She's expecting me." Hamilton's gaze didn't waver. "Your meeting has been cancelled," he said flatly. "Now please come with us." The bank's grand space, once a symbol of confidence and progress, now felt like a stage. Whispers floated through the air, clients murmuring behind manicured hands, junior bankers exchanging quick, alarmed glances. The polished floors reflected the tense tableau, as though capturing the silent judgment. Shaq's mind leapt to his mother's voice, reminding him of dignity, of never allowing others to dictate his worth. But the flush of humiliation was undeniable. Despite his towering frame and public recognition, he felt the weight of powerlessness closing in. He considered resisting, demanding a clearer explanation, but something in Hamilton's eyes, a hint of smugness, of waiting for an outburst, held him back. This was a trap laid with precision, designed to force a reaction, to brand him as uncooperative. "I'll leave," Shaq said finally, his voice low, the bitterness carefully hidden. He straightened his shoulders, pivoted on his polished heels, and began walking toward the glass doors. The security guards trailed him, their footsteps echoing softly. His pulse pounded in his ears, each step measured to convey control. Outside, the city's pulse throbbed as if oblivious to the quiet storm unfolding. Yet before Shaq could push the heavy door open, Hamilton's voice, louder now, sliced through the tension. "For the record, Mr. O'Neill, we're terminating your access to your accounts pending an internal investigation," Hamilton announced, loud enough to draw gasps from the scattered onlookers. Any further attempt to access interglobal trust facilities will result in legal action. Shaq froze, his hand hovering over the door handle. A wave of disbelief, sharper and deeper than before, surged through him. His mind registered the implications, the billions in his accounts, the carefully planned community projects, the philanthropic ventures, all frozen, all at risk. The bank, with its gleaming surfaces and hollow promises, had turned its back on him in full view of the public. He turned slightly, meeting Hamilton's gaze with a level stare. "Understood," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried through the hushed lobby. He didn't wait for a response, didn't glance back at the murmuring crowd, or the whispering junior bankers. He pushed open the glass doors and stepped into the afternoon sunlight, the glare momentarily blinding. Outside, the city thrummed on, indifferent to the unraveling of a man's legacy. Shaq stood on the steps, the weight of what had just occurred pressing down on him, heavier than any burden he'd borne before. His phone buzzed again, this time a flood of notifications, news alerts, texts, missed calls. The story was already spreading, faster than he could grasp, and the headlines twisted the narrative into something cruel and sensational. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, driven by his longtime aide, Connor Daniels, whose anxious expression barely masked his shock. "What the hell happened in there?" Connor asked, as Shaq slid into the back seat. Shaq exhaled slowly, his hands trembling slightly, though his face remained composed. "They shut me out," he said quietly. "Everything. They're accusing me of fraud." Connor's mouth opened in disbelief, but Shaq raised a hand, silencing him. "Get me to the office," he said, his voice edged with a determination born from years of navigating obstacles, though this betrayal cut deeper than any he'd faced before. As the car pulled into traffic, Shaq's mind churned, sifting through layers of betrayal, calculating the damage, and plotting his next move. His heart hammered, not with rage, but with an icy resolve. They had tried to strip him of his power, his dignity, but they had underestimated one thing: Big Shaq's capacity to turn humiliation into strength. The news hit like a tidal wave, surging through every media outlet and social network with brutal force. Within hours of the public spectacle at Interglobal Trust's lobby, Shaq's name was plastered across headlines, social feeds buzzing with a blend of shock, speculation, and thinly veiled schadenfreude. The narrative twisted cruelly. No longer was he the beloved, philanthropic giant of industry, but now painted as a man suspected of fraud, betrayal, and financial impropriety. The story's hook sank deep, snaring public attention with tantalizing hints of scandal, the details distorted beyond recognition. Inside his sleek downtown office, the blinds half drawn against the mid-afternoon sun, Shaq sat at his desk, hands clasped tightly, eyes scanning the flood of incoming alerts on his phone and computer. The names of those who once stood by his side now appeared in news snippets and hastily drafted statements distancing themselves from him. Old friends in rude rooms, business partners who had toasted victories in private lounges, all now fell silent, or worse, issued thin generic messages of concern that felt more like betrayal. Each one landed like a slap, a reminder that loyalty in the world of high finance was fragile, often disappearing at the first hint of controversy. His longtime associate Vincent Rourke, a man known for his steely demeanor and razor-sharp instincts, called, his voice crackling with the stress of someone trying to contain a wildfire. "Shaq, we've got massive withdrawals coming through every channel. Investors are pulling funds left and right. We're talking billions. They're scared." Vincent's words were clipped, but the unspoken panic hung heavy in the space between them. Shaq's jaw tightened, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just a rumor. It was an orchestrated, calculated strike, designed to dismantle his financial stronghold. Behind the media's frenzied headlines lurked whispers of rivals, the same polished faces he'd shaken hands with at charity galas and investment summits, now exploiting his vulnerability. Their private communications, leaked selectively, painted a damning portrait: a man reckless with funds, a leader whose integrity was cracking under pressure. He glanced at the scrolling headlines. O'Neill's empire teeters on brink of collapse. Fraud allegations spark panic. Big Shaq in deep financial trouble. Each one twisted the knife deeper, but Shaq's mind was already working, probing for weaknesses in the web spun around him. He wasn't naive. He knew power games played at this level were rarely straightforward. What unsettled him wasn't the betrayal itself. He'd learned long ago to expect that, but the sheer speed with which the walls were closing in. As dusk bled into the city skyline outside his window, a new notification lit up his screen. an emergency board meeting called by the majority stakeholders of his largest venture. The message was curt. The time set for just 2 hours from now. Shaq recognized the maneuver instantly. A power play to isolate him, to force his hand before he could mount a defense. In the quiet moments that followed, he thought of the community center he'd envisioned in his father's honor, of the people it was meant to uplift, of the countless promises he had made. This wasn't just about preserving his wealth, it was about protecting a legacy, a commitment to something far bigger than himself. The stakes were more than personal, they were generational. The walls of his office, lined with framed photos of family, moments of triumph, and mementos from his career, seemed to close in, the weight of expectation pressing down. His mother's words echoed in his memory, a quiet refrain urging him to rise above the noise, to hold his ground. His daughter's laughter, so vivid in his mind, reminded him that his fight wasn't just for himself, but for the future they all deserved. Outside, the city hummed with its usual rhythm. But within Shaq's world, the tempo had shifted to something more urgent, more perilous. Rivals he hadn't thought of in years were emerging from the shadows, their names whispered in meetings he was no longer invited to, their hands quietly moving pieces on a board he'd thought he controlled. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was a quiet, precise bleeding of power, designed to leave him cornered and isolated. A message popped up from an old contact, Gideon Kessler, a hedge fund magnate with a reputation for opportunism. Heard what happened. Tough break. If you're looking to unload some assets, I might be interested. The message was brief, but dripping with predatory intent. Shaq felt a flash of cold anger, a sharp contrast to the composure he fought to maintain. He closed the message without responding. The calls kept coming, panicked clients demanding explanations, desperate advisors trying to plug holes in the dam. Shaq listened, responded where he could, but his focus was already shifting. He could feel the pulse of the market turning against him, the whispers growing into roars. But amid the cacophony, he held on to a single unwavering truth. They could strip away his wealth, tarnish his name, but they couldn't erase his resolve. As the city lights flickered to life beyond his office window, he stood, drawing a deep breath, and turned to face the night. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a battle he hadn't anticipated, but one he was ready to fight with strategy, with resilience, and with the quiet, unyielding strength that had always defined Big Shaq. In the silence of his private study, with the city's faint glow filtering through the heavy curtains, Shaq sat in contemplation. The weight of betrayal, the sting of public humiliation, the suffocating whispers of Wall Street, these hung over him like a heavy fog. But Shaq was not a man built to crumble beneath pressure. He was built for quiet strength, for resilience honed over decades of navigating treacherous waters. The world outside clamored for a reaction, a public statement, a defiant denial. Yet he chose silence, not out of fear, but because strategy demanded it. As the hum of distant traffic blended with the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner, his thoughts drifted to the unwavering presence of his mother, Lucille. She had always been a wellspring of wisdom, her voice a calming counterpoint to the chaos of his world. He could almost hear her now, reminding him of the value of patience, of measured actions over hasty reactions. Memories of childhood surfaced, Lucille standing firm in the face of adversity, teaching him to carry his head high, to listen more than speak, to stand his ground with quiet dignity. He rose from the leather chair, stretching his tall frame as if shaking off the dust of defeat. Crossing the room, he pulled a framed photo from the shelf, a candid snapshot of himself and his daughter Mara taken at a charity event years ago. Her radiant smile, her youthful energy, the way she'd always managed to make him laugh even in the darkest times. She embodied hope, the future he fought for, the legacy he refused to let crumble. He traced the edge of the photo with his thumb, a surge of determination tightening his jaw. The public might see silence as submission, but for Shaq it was the gathering of strength. He knew that speaking out too soon without a plan would be like pouring gasoline on an open flame. His enemies would seize on any misstep, twisting it into proof of guilt. Instead, he reached out discreetly to those he trusted, the old allies who had stood by him through past storms. Not everyone had turned their back. There were still voices of loyalty, quiet but firm, waiting for his signal. He met with them in nondescript locations, far from the glaring eyes of the media. In the dim back room of a community center in Oakland, he sat with Marcus Blackwood, a respected community organizer, and Celeste Durham, a seasoned attorney known for her unshakable integrity. Their faces, etched with concern and quiet defiance, gave Shaq the clarity he needed. They didn't ask for explanations. They offered their unwavering support. "Don't let them define you, Shaq," Celeste said, her voice low but resolute. "You built more than just wealth. You built trust. You built a voice for people who never had one. That doesn't vanish overnight, because of a few headlines." Marcus nodded, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "We'll hold the line. The real community knows who you are. They won't forget that." These meetings weren't dramatic, weren't flashy. They were precise, deliberate steps in reclaiming control. Through whispered strategy sessions and coded messages, Shaq began weaving a plan. He tapped into networks that transcended corporate boardrooms, the neighborhood associations, the educators, the local business owners, who had seen firsthand what his investments meant. Each conversation was a brick in the foundation of his comeback, each alliance a shield against the tidal wave of lies. At night, as the city settled into its rhythm of neon lights and distant sirens, Shaq sat alone with his thoughts, the weight of responsibility pressing in. He considered the generations before him who had fought battles with far fewer resources, the quiet strength of his ancestors who had faced down injustice with dignity and resolve. Their struggles were etched into his bones, fueling a determination that no scandal could erode. He thought, too, of Mara, of the promises he had made her, of the example he needed to set. She would see this unfold, would see how her father responded to betrayal and adversity. It wasn't enough to protect his legacy. He had to show her what it meant to stand firm, to fight back with intelligence and integrity. His resolve wasn't loud, wasn't blustering. It was measured, strategic, a silent gathering of force. In the early morning light, Shaq stood at the window of his study, the city skyline painted in shades of gold and gray. The headlines continued to churn, the whispers persisted, but his mind was clearer than it had been in days. He wasn't waiting for the world's permission to reclaim his narrative. He was building his own path forward, brick by brick, alliance by alliance, until the truth stood unshakable against the tide of lies. This was not the end. It was the turning point. And Shaq was ready. As dawn painted the skyline in muted shades of blue and gray, Shaq sat alone in his penthouse office, the city below a blurred canvas of shadows and light. His mind churned through strategies, each more desperate than the last. Yet none offered a clear path forward. The panic withdrawals continued, his name marred by scandal, his legacy threatened with erasure. His phone lay silent, the screen dark. Even Connor's frantic calls from the previous day had given way to uneasy silence. It was as if the world had turned its back, leaving him in the eye of a storm he couldn't see his way out of. Then, as the first rays of sunlight edged over the distant hills, a faint chime cut through the stillness. A single encrypted message appeared on his private terminal, one reserved for emergency communications, known only to a handful of trusted contacts. But the sender was unfamiliar. No name, no number, just a string of characters that seemed random until a second message followed. It read, "Peregrine. Trust is a blade. Use it wisely. Meet me where the stars are grounded." Shaq's pulse quickened. He leaned forward, reading and rereading the lines, mind parsing their possible meaning. Peregrine, a name as enigmatic as the words themselves. The second message vanished, as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving no trace. Shaq stared at the empty screen, the silence around him suddenly charged with electricity. He understood the risk. This could be a trap, a misdirection, an elaborate setup. But the coded message wasn't just a riddle, it was a challenge, a provocation aimed directly at him. He stood, the weight of indecision heavy on his shoulders, and then he made the call. Connor arrived within the hour, his expression tight with worry, but Shaq's voice was calm, measured. "I need you to arrange a meet," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Somewhere public but discreet. I'll tell you where, no question." By nightfall, Shaq was standing beneath the massive metal beams of the old Sky Bridge, a disused structure connecting two abandoned towers slated for demolition. The location, a relic of a once grand project, fit the cryptic phrase perfectly. Stars above, concrete beneath, the perfect blend of symbolism and secrecy. The air was cool, the city's hum distant yet persistent. A faint rustle echoed from the shadows, and a figure emerged, a man cloaked in a dark overcoat, his face obscured by a low-brimmed hat. He stopped a few paces from Shaq, his posture relaxed yet charged with a quiet intensity. The man spoke in a voice both unfamiliar and oddly resonant, calm but threaded with purpose. "You're in deeper than you know, Big Shaq," he said softly. "The system you've built your empire on is rotting from within. They used you as a pawn, a symbol, and now they're discarding you because you no longer serve their purpose." Shaq's fists clenched at his sides, the anger controlled but palpable. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low, steady. "Call me Peregrine," the man said, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "I'm here because you need a way out. Not just for your billions, but for the truth. They've been laundering power through you, using your name to legitimize their schemes. But you already know that, don't you? You've seen the hints, the accounts that didn't add up, the deals that felt too smooth." Shaq's breath caught. He had seen the patterns, the subtle discrepancies in the paperwork, the uneasy sense that something bigger was operating just beneath the surface. But he hadn't pieced it together, not fully, until now. "Why help me?" he asked, suspicion coloring his tone. Peregrine's smile vanished. "Because I don't want them to win, and because your fall is just the beginning. They'll replace you with someone else, someone more pliable. The community center, the projects you believe in, they'll become fronts for their operations. You have the power to stop it, but not if you play by their rules." From his coat, Peregrine produced a slim device, no larger than a credit card, and held it out. "Encrypted data, proof of their networks, offshore accounts, coded transactions, communications. It's all here, but it's dangerous, and once you open it, you'll be a target from every side." Shaq hesitated, the weight of the choice pressing down like gravity. His instincts screamed caution, the years of navigating treacherous business landscapes warning him against taking such a leap. Yet beneath that wariness stirred something deeper. A spark of defiance, a refusal to be broken, a flicker of the legacy his mother and father had instilled in him. He stepped forward, took the device from Peregrine's hand, and met his gaze squarely. "If I do this, I need guarantees," he said, his voice roughened by determination. "I need to know you're not leading me into a bigger trap." Peregrine inclined his head. "There are no guarantees in this game, Shaq. Only choices. But if you want your life, your name, your legacy back, you'll have to play by a different set of rules. Trust is a blade. Use it wisely." With that, Peregrine turned and melted back into the shadows, his steps silent, leaving Shaq standing beneath the iron bones of the sky bridge, the weight of the device in his hand heavier than gold. The city's pulse quickened around him, the lights shimmering like distant stars, and he felt the first real pulse of possibility in days. The stakes had risen, the game had changed, and Big Shaq was no longer merely a pawn in their schemes. He was ready to fight back with strategy, with purpose, and with a determination that no one, not even the shadows behind the boardrooms, could anticipate. In the sleepless nights that followed his encounter with Peregrine, Shaq moved like a shadow through his own empire. His penthouse became a command center, a place where whispers of corruption and coded data slowly unwound themselves into chilling truths. The device Peregrine had handed him proved to be more than a simple key. It was a labyrinth of encrypted files, hidden trails of financial deceit that linked interglobal trusts' gleaming marble lobbies to the murky depths of systemic corruption. Shaq wasn't alone in this pursuit. He'd quietly reassembled a circle of loyal advisors, each sworn to silence, each piecing together fragments of a story long hidden beneath polished facades. Night after night, Shaq sat at his long polished desk, its surface littered with printouts, digital decrypts, and hastily scrawled notes. Celeste Durham, her keen legal mind sharpened by years of navigating corporate gray areas, worked silently at a side table, cross-referencing data points with meticulous precision. Connor Daniels, normally a voice of steady pragmatism, had become uncharacteristically quiet, his brow furrowed as he sifted through call logs and encrypted emails. Each document unearthed wasn't merely a number or a transaction. It was a thread pulling at the integrity of the bank itself. The first undeniable crack came in the form of coded communications between senior bank executives, their conversations laced with veiled references to legacy accounts and selective client vetting. These weren't casual exchanges. They outlined a system designed to exploit minority clients, subtly directing them into high-fee, low-return products, while shielding wealthier, whiter clients with preferential terms. Shaq's heart clenched as he read through them, each line a dagger, not just for himself but for countless others who'd trusted institutions that thrived on deception. He recalled his own meeting weeks ago with Catherine Ashbury, how her eyes had flickered when he mentioned the community center's funding. Now it all made sense. The delays, the evasive answers, the quiet discomfort. She had known, or at least suspected. The deeper they dug, the more damning the revelations became. Offshore accounts, linked to shell companies, funneled funds from community programs into shadowy entities with no public trace. Names appeared. Executives, trustees, even prominent city officials, all tied to a scheme that balanced profit on the backs of discrimination. It wasn't just financial, it was systemic, woven into the very architecture of the bank's operations. Shaq's temples ached with the weight of it. He imagined the countless clients, families, small business owners, retirees, quietly siphoned of their dreams, while the public-facing smiles of the bank's leadership promised prosperity and fairness. The realization ignited something in him, a rage that wasn't loud, but settled deep in his chest, steady and resolute. Late one night, as the city below pulsed with a faint hum of traffic and neon, a breakthrough emerged. Connor found a series of internal memos buried deep within archived servers, communications between compliance officers and the risk management division. The language was deliberately obtuse, but the message was clear. Discrepancies in Shaq's accounts had been fabricated, a smokescreen to trigger the public spectacle of his downfall. It wasn't just negligence, it was sabotage, executed with clinical precision to strip him of power, wealth, and credibility. Celeste leaned back in her chair, her eyes glinting with a mix of disbelief and determination. "This isn't just about you, Shaq," she said quietly. "This is a blueprint for how they've maintained control for years. If we bring this to light, it won't just clear your name, it'll shake the entire foundation they've built." Shaq stood at the window, the city's lights reflecting in the glass, his reflection a tall silhouette of quiet resolve. He knew exposing this wouldn't be simple. The forces arrayed against him were vast, their influence threaded through corridors of power that extended far beyond the walls of interglobal trust. But he also understood the stakes weren't just his fortune or reputation. They were the dignity of every client exploited, every voice silenced by a system designed to exclude. The next evening, under cover of darkness, he arranged clandestine meetings with trusted community leaders, people who had known him before the headlines, before the wealth, when he was simply Shaquille O'Neal, a man driven by the values instilled by Lucille. In dimly lit church basements and quiet cafe backrooms, he shared what he had uncovered, laying bare the rot at the heart of the bank's success. Their reactions were a mix of disbelief, anger, and solidarity. Together they formed an informal alliance, a coalition determined to confront the truth head-on. Back in his office, Shaq mapped out a strategy, not a reckless expose that would invite swift retaliation, but a carefully orchestrated plan to dismantle the network from within. His approach was methodical, leveraging the very tools used against him. He drafted statements, gathered testimonials, and prepared the evidence to withstand the inevitable legal onslaught. Every step forward was calculated, every move weighed against the risk of escalation. As dawn crept over the city once more, Shaq stood at the center of his office, surrounded by stacks of evidence. His shoulders squared and his gaze steady. The cracks in the marble were no longer hidden. They were exposed, jagged, undeniable. The system that had once seemed unassailable now trembled on the brink of collapse. And with each passing hour, Shaq's resolve hardened. They had tried to erase him, to reduce him to a cautionary tale, but they had underestimated the power of quiet determination, of justice pursued not with anger, but with unyielding purpose. And now the clock was ticking. Shaq stood before the towering glass walls of Interglobal Trust's executive boardroom, the early morning light casting long shadows across the glossy floor. His tailored suit was immaculate, but it was his posture, a quiet, measured command, that filled the room with tension. The members of the board, a collection of sharp-suited executives and polished legal minds, sat in uneasy silence, their eyes flicking between Shaq and each other. The weight of the past week's revelations hung heavy in the air, a storm gathering behind closed doors. The evidence Shaq and his inner circle had unearthed had been carefully, methodically prepared. Coded emails, secret memos, falsified account statements, each document a blade poised at the jugular of the institution's reputation. But Shaq wasn't here for revenge. He was here to force the hand of those who had underestimated him. The room's usual hum of confidence was replaced by the quiet shuffle of papers and the shallow breathing of men and women suddenly uncertain of their footing. At the head of the long mahogany table sat Jeffrey Langford, the bank's chairman, a man whose silver hair and calm demeanor belied a ruthless instinct for survival. He offered a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss O'Neill," he said, his voice controlled. "I trust you've considered the implications of bringing unsubstantiated claims to this table." Shaq's eyes met Langford's with an unwavering calm. "The evidence speaks for itself," he said, his voice low but carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Selective discrimination, illicit fund diversions, and falsified accusations against a high-profile client. This isn't speculation, it's fact." A murmur rippled through the room, but Shaq continued, laying a slim folder of encrypted data on the table. His actions were deliberate, controlled, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "This folder contains the trail," he said. "It names, exposes transactions, and shows exactly how you've been manipulating clients like me to cover losses, launder funds, and mask systemic racism. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is how much damage you're willing to let it do." Langford's smile faltered, his fingers tightening on the armrest of his chair. One of the junior executives to his right, a man Shaq recognized from earlier dealings, cleared his throat, his voice thin. "These are serious allegations. If they're made public, they will be," Shaq interrupted, his tone sharper now, "unless we come to an agreement." His hands remained steady on the table, his face composed, but his eyes flashed with a controlled fire. "I don't need to bring this to the media. I don't need a public spectacle. What I need is accountability and restitution. Not just for me but for every client who's been exploited. You can choose to fight this and lose, or you can choose to settle it quietly and start making things right." Langford glanced at his legal counsel, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, who shifted uncomfortably, whispering behind his hand. Shaq watched the silent exchange, the cracks in their united front becoming more pronounced. He could sense the shift, the fear creeping into their polished facades, the realization that their carefully curated power was vulnerable. Behind closed doors, Shaq had already orchestrated quiet conversations with regulators, community leaders, and key investors. He knew the board's real fear wasn't public scandal. It was the silent exodus of confidence. The investors quietly pulling out, the regulators launching quiet, but lethal investigations. He didn't need to shout his demands. He needed only to lean in with quiet certainty and let the weight of their own corruption collapse the walls they'd built around themselves. Langford's voice broke the silence, quieter now, tinged with a reluctant respect. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. O'Neill?" Shaq's smile was faint but unmistakable. "I want the funds restored," he said. "Every dollar taken from my accounts, plus damages. But more than that, I want systemic changes. I want the discriminatory policies dismantled. I want a public commitment to transparency, and I want it signed by every one of you." He paused, letting the demand settle, watching as the executive exchanged anxious glances. "If you refuse, I walk out of this room and into the offices of every major media outlet in the country. And I promise you, the fallout will be swift and unrelenting." Langford's mask slipped, a flicker of desperation crossing his face before he recovered. "That's extortion," he said quietly. Shaq leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "No, Jeffrey. That's leverage. That's me playing by your rules. But with my pieces, you tried to crush me, but you forgot one thing. I'm not just a name. I'm a man with a community, a legacy, and now the truth. You can't silence that." For a long moment, the boardroom was silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Then, slowly, Langford exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "We'll review your terms," he said, his voice hollow. Shaq nodded, standing tall, his gaze sweeping the room. "You have 24 hours, he said. "After that, the story breaks. Choose wisely." Without another word, he turned and strode from the room, the echo of his footsteps a sharp counterpoint to the stunned silence left behind. Outside the boardroom, Connor and Celeste waited, their expressions tense but hopeful. Shaq met their eyes with a nod, the first genuine hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "It's done," he said quietly. "Now we wait." The game wasn't over, but the rules had changed, and for the first time in weeks, Shaq felt the weight of the fight shift, not in his favor but back to a place where he could control the board. The boardroom silence hadn't yet dissipated when Shaq returned to his private office, the weight of decisions lingering in his mind. Though he'd left Interglobal Trust with leverage, he knew the battle was far from over. It was in these quiet moments, as the city outside hummed and headlines threatened to ignite, that betrayals often surfaced. Yet, Nothing had prepared him for the shock that was about to unfold, one that would cut deeper than corporate machinations or public scandal. Connor Daniels, his trusted aide, his confidant, through thick and thin, was already seated at the corner of the office when Shaq entered. The man's normally composed demeanor appeared strained, his shoulders tense, his eyes flicking toward the floor as if struggling to meet Shaq's gaze. Shaq registered the shift, a quiet alarm tightening in his chest, but he approached without breaking stride. "What's the status with the compliance team?" Shaq asked, voice calm, though his mind buzzed with anticipation. Connor hesitated, his fingers curling into the armrests of the chair. "There's been a delay," he said, the words clipped and careful. "Legal's dragging their feet. Langford's people are buying time." Shaq's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't make sense. We pressured them hard enough. They should be scrambling to meet the demands." "What aren't you saying, Connor?" The air thickened between them, an invisible thread of tension drawing taut. Connor's jaw worked silently, as though weighing the cost of his next words. Finally, he exhaled, a slow breath that seemed to deflate his posture. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said quietly. "They came to me months ago, offered me a position, incentives, if I played along. At first, it was minor things, delays, deflections, but it escalated. And when the accusations surfaced against you, I froze. I thought they were bluffing, that it would blow over." The words landed like punches. Shaq stood motionless, his thoughts crashing into each other, the room's edges blurring. Connor's confession wasn't a dramatic outburst, but a quiet admission that shattered the trust they'd built over years. The man he'd leaned on during this crisis, who had stood by him in countless battles, had been working with the very people orchestrating his downfall. Shaq turned away, his breath shallow, his gaze fixing on the city's skyline. Betrayal wasn't foreign to him. He'd navigated boardrooms filled with hidden knives. But this was different. This was personal. A fracture not just of professional alliances, but of friendship, of loyalty that he'd believed unshakable. His voice when it came was low and strained. "Why didn't you come to me?" Connor's voice cracked. "I was scared. I thought they'd bury me, that they'd come after my family. They said you'd be fine, that it was just business. But then it spun out of control, and I didn't know how to stop it." Shaq's hands curled into fists at his sides, the controlled anger surfacing in a tight line of his jaw. But even as fury surged, a deeper clarity settled. This wasn't just betrayal, it was an opportunity. If Connor had been manipulated, he wasn't alone. There were likely others within the system who had been coerced, compromised, trapped in the web of Langford's corrupt network. Shaq's pulse steadied as he turned back to face the man who, moments ago, had been his most trusted ally. "I should walk you out right now," Shaq said, his voice taut. "But I won't. Not because I forgive you, but because I need you to make this right. You're going to help me dismantle their leverage. From the inside." Connor's head snapped up, his expression a mix of disbelief and fragile hope. "You're not cutting me out?" Shaq's eyes were steel. "You've already chosen your side, Connor. Now you'll prove where your loyalty really lies. You'll gather everything, names, accounts, communications, and you'll deliver it to me. Not to Langford, not to their lawyers. To me." The weight of the moment settled over them. The quiet understanding of the path forward marked not by trust but necessity. Connor swallowed hard, nodding, the shadows of guilt lingering behind his eyes. "I'll get it. Everything I can." As Connor left the office, shoulders hunched and steps hesitant, Shaq remained rooted to the floor. The city's pulse beyond the windows, no longer distant, but immediate, urgent. His mind raced with strategy, recalibrating plans with this new information. The betrayal had stung, but it had also provided a crack in the enemy's armor, a chance to strike from within, to exploit the same weakness that had nearly undone him. Later that night, in a dimly lit room surrounded by blueprints and data files, Shaq met with Celeste and Marcus. He laid out Connor's confession, the raw edges of the betrayal exposed but transformed into tactical advantage. Celeste's eyes narrowed, her legal mind already mapping the possibilities, while Marcus clenched his fists, his voice low with conviction. "They thought they had you beaten," he said, "but now you've got their own man on the inside. That's a weapon they won't see coming." Shaq nodded, the pieces falling into place with cold precision. The betrayal that had nearly broken him had instead become the pivot point, the moment where desperation turned into calculated strength. He wouldn't just survive this storm, he would control it, reshape it, and make sure the legacy he fought for remained unshaken. As dawn approached, Shaq stood by the window once more. The city's first light spilling across his face. The world believed he was on the brink of collapse. A man betrayed and broken. But beneath the surface, a new strategy was forming. One rooted not in loyalty, but in clarity, resilience, and a quiet resolve to outmaneuver those who had tried to right his downfall. This wasn't the end of the game. It was a sharp strategic beginning. Shaq stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, the morning sun casting a crisp light on the crowds gathered below. Reporters with notepads poised, cameras angled for the perfect shot, onlookers buzzing with anticipation. It all blended into a low hum that vibrated through the air. The past weeks had been a relentless tide of whispers, strategy and betrayal, yet today felt different. This wasn't the beginning of a public outcry fueled by half-truths and media manipulation. This was the culmination of a deliberate strategic campaign that struck at the heart of a corrupt institution without shedding blood or bending the law. Inside, in the grand marbled courtroom, the atmosphere had been taut with tension, as Shaq's legal team, spearheaded by Celeste Durham, presented irrefutable evidence drawn from months of covert investigations. Detailed financial records, coded communications, and confidential internal memos illuminated a shadowy network of discriminatory practices and financial fraud stretching back years. The quiet efficiency of the courtroom contrasted sharply with the storm of accusations that had first swept over Shaq like an unforgiving wave. Langford and his once confident board sat grim-faced at the defendant's table, their polished exteriors cracking under the weight of the evidence. They whispered urgently with legal counsel, their earlier bravado drained into palpable dread. Shaq watched, his expression calm yet steely, as his team's arguments dismantled the veneer of integrity interglobal trust had long hidden behind. The judge's voice, measured and clear, delivered the ruling with a finality that resonated through the chamber. Financial penalties totaling in the billions, forced resignations, regulatory oversight imposed, and a mandatory restructuring of client policies aimed at eradicating discriminatory practices. No violence, no raised voices, just the cold, precise application of justice that left no room for misinterpretation. Outside, as Celeste and Marcus joined him on the courthouse steps, reporters surged forward, microphones thrust like weapons demanding sound bites. Shaq raised a hand, signaling for silence, and the crowd fell into a hush. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, carrying the weight of quiet authority. "This isn't just about me," he said. "This is about every person who's ever been shut out, deceived or exploited by a system designed to keep them powerless. Today's decision isn't the end of the fight. It's the beginning of something better. We've shown that change doesn't come through violence or anger. It comes from truth, persistence, and unity." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was steady, a rising swell of support that wrapped around Shaq like a shield. He glanced at Celeste, who gave a small nod of approval, and at Marcus, whose clenched jaw relaxed into a rare, proud smile. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a communal reckoning, a ripple effect that would reverberate far beyond the courtroom steps. Later that evening, as the city's skyline shimmered under a velvet sky, Shaq sat alone in his study, the quiet a stark contrast to the day's events. His phone buzzed intermittently with congratulations, offers for interviews, requests for statements, but he let them sit unanswered. The victory felt less like a celebration, and more like a moment of deep, reflective calm. He thought of his father, whose values had been a silent compass through the storm, of his mother, Lucille, whose wisdom echoed in every measured decision, and of his daughter, Mara, whose future had been the silent driver of his every move. The journey hadn't been without scars. The betrayal by Connor, the erosion of trust in corners he'd once considered safe, the public spectacle of his reputation nearly torn apart, it all lingered beneath the surface. Yet he felt no bitterness. What he felt was resolve, a deep understanding that power wielded responsibly could shape a better world. In the distance, the city lights pulsed steadily, a silent reminder of the countless lives intertwined with his own story. Shaq's name had been cleared, but the fight for justice was far from over. As he leaned back in his chair, hands steepled beneath his chin, he knew that while today had brought a measure of peace, it was merely a stepping stone toward broader change. The real victory was not in the headlines or the court rulings, but in the quiet, enduring promise that integrity, strategy, and unwavering resolve could and would triumph over corruption and injustice. As the afternoon sun spilled its golden light over the newly christened O'Neill Community Center, the air buzzed with a mixture of anticipation and gratitude. Families gathered, children laughed, and played under banners fluttering in the breeze, and longtime supporters mingled with fresh faces drawn by the promise of change. The center, a gleaming testament to resilience and hope, stood proudly at the heart of the city, a symbol not just of wealth restored but of integrity reclaimed. Shaq stood at the center of it all, his towering frame casting a protective shadow over the stage where he would soon address the crowd. The past months had tested him in ways he'd never imagined, stripping away illusions, exposing fault lines in trust, and forcing him to confront the harsh realities of systemic corruption. But through every setback, every whispered betrayal, and every moment of doubt, he had kept his focus anchored to this vision, one born from his father's teachings and his mother's unwavering belief in justice. The billions recovered from the settlement with interglobal trust hadn't been funneled into private coffers or spent on hollow shows of wealth. Instead, they had been channeled into initiatives designed to break the cycles of exclusion and disenfranchisement that had for so long defined the system. The community center, complete with educational programs, healthcare services, and entrepreneurial incubators, was only the beginning. Grants for minority-owned businesses, scholarships for underrepresented youth, and partnerships with advocacy groups painted a picture of lasting impact, each project a deliberate choice to rewrite a narrative long dominated by exploitation. As the crowd settled, Shaq took the stage, the applause rising like a steady wave. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and strong, carrying the weight of experience tempered by hope. "My father once told me that real power isn't in how much you own or control," he said, pausing to let the words sink in. "It's in what you choose to do with the strength you're given. Today isn't just about what we've built. It's about who we've become and where we're headed together." He glanced at Mira, standing at the edge of the stage, her eyes bright with pride. She had been his anchor, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Lucille stood nearby, her expression a quiet blend of pride and resolve, her presence a testament to the values she had instilled in him. The applause swelled again, but Shaq held up a hand, inviting quiet, reflective listening. "I know what it means to be underestimated, to have your integrity questioned, your name dragged through the mud," he continued, his tone steady but charged with emotion. "But I also know the power of resilience, of standing up not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been silenced by fear or crushed by injustice. Today, we show that you can't buy dignity, you can't steal a legacy, and you can't break a spirit that refuses to bend." The crowd erupted into applause, but Shaq's focus remained inward, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him, people who had walked beside him through the storm, allies who had once doubted but now stood steadfast, children whose futures now sparkled with new possibilities. This wasn't just a victory lap, it was a vow. He stepped down from the stage, mingling with the attendees, exchanging handshakes, hugs, and quiet words of encouragement. He listened as small business owners shared their stories, as parents expressed gratitude for the educational opportunities their children would now have, as elders recounted how the system had once failed them but now, thanks to his efforts, offered a glimmer of hope. Each interaction grounded him, a reminder that wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used to lift others. Later, as the sun dipped below the skyline and shadows lengthened across the plaza, Shaq retreated to a quiet corner near the community center's entrance. Mara joined him, her arm slipping through his. "You did it, Dad," she said softly, her voice a blend of pride and awe. Shaq looked down at her, a faint smile touching his lips. "We did it," he corrected, his voice low. "This isn't just mine, it's ours, and it's only the beginning." Behind them, the celebration continued, music filling the air, laughter rising in waves, the promise of a community reborn shimmering in every light, strung across the plaza. Shaq's thoughts, however, stretched beyond the immediate moment. He knew challenges would come. Resistance from entrenched interests, unforeseen setbacks, the long, grinding work of real systemic change. But the foundation was laid, solid and unshakable, built not on vengeance but on purpose. He turned toward the building, its gleaming windows reflecting the glow of twilight. Inside those walls, children would learn, entrepreneurs would rise, families would find support where once there had been only obstacles. The community would grow stronger, not because of him alone, but because of the collective strength they now embraced. As he stood there, Lucille joined them, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "Your father would be proud," she said softly, her voice threaded with emotion. Shaq nodded, his gaze lingering on the horizon, where city lights met the deepening sky. "I hope so," he said, his voice carrying a mix of humility and quiet determination. Because this isn't about me. It's about making sure no one else has to fight the same battles we did. It's about making sure the door stays open for everyone who comes after. With that, they stood together in the fading light. 3 generations bound by love, resilience, and the unbreakable conviction that justice was not just an ideal, but a responsibility. And as the first stars appeared overhead, Shaq knew, with a certainty born of hard-fought experience, that his legacy was secure, not in the wealth he had reclaimed, but in the lives he had helped lift, the doors he had opened, and the hope he had rekindled for generations to come. Every system is built on stories, and every story needs a voice willing to challenge the rules, stand with those who refuse to be silenced, who turn betrayal into blueprints for change, share the truth, ignite conversations, and be the force that transforms injustice into opportunity. Because the fight doesn't end here, it's just getting started.